Welcome to the WanderLearn podcast. I'm your host, France Tapon. This is a short introduction to this episode, which is part of a 7-part series with a Mozambican who is named Julio Maria Muhorro. He is a power coach, facilitator, and speaker from Mozambique. Make sure you listen to the other episodes if you've missed them. And this episode, by the way, is brought to you by my patrons at patreon.com/ftapon. Go there and get some rewards. Thanks. How many countries have you been to? Like 15,
We were
20?
counting, and it was 17 countries,
Okay,
including Mozambique.
Right. So 17 countries, and maybe about 6 of them, maybe 7 of them are in Africa, and maybe 10 outside of Africa. And
Yeah.
you've hit many continents. You've been to Asia, you've been to the Americas.
I've been to Asia, I've been to Europe, to North and South America, and in Africa. I'm just missing Australia, New Zealand, and Antarctica at this point.
Yes, we're all missing Antarctica. So my question to you is, what do you think of as a kind of a unique characteristic, good or bad, about Mozambique? In other words, what characterizes your people and your culture? I mean, I realize it's a tough question because Mozambique is a spectrum.
Quite diverse,
and you've got a lot of diversity from the north, the south, the middle, all over the place, the coast, inland, different villages, city. I mean, I realize this is a crazy question, but if you were to ask me, I mean, the United States is also a diverse country, but if you ask me what characterizes America, I could kind of come up with an answer. You know, what Americans have in common. They're assholes. They're all assholes. All right. And so now what about you? What do you say?
I'll say that it's the easiness of Mozambican people that always surprises me. And it doesn't really matter where I am. Mozambicans just have this thing of everything is going to be all right, and you shouldn't worry too much about it. That it can be great, but it also can be quite, infuriating and detriment to their own development and growth. But there is just a sense of like, oh, it's going to be fine. We're going to figure it out, even though you have no idea how that's going to happen.
Have you heard the French expression "ça va aller"?
No.
Okay, ça va aller. So if you go to almost half of Africa speaks French. And there's a saying that you hear all over Francophone Africa, which is ça va aller, which means it will all be just fine.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think it's not just Mozambican, it's African.
Yeah, it is an African thing. But maybe, again, you have been to other countries, so maybe Mozambique is much more relaxed and laid back than, let's say, South Africa,
of
and
course.
More so than Kenya and maybe even Tanzania too.
Actually, it is. And I feel it also comes down to the culture. So for instance, in Makua culture, there are two things that sort of quite striking. So one is you should always answer with a smile. So if someone's beat you up, someone does something wrong, just smile. They're hurting. So hurt people. You shouldn't perpetuate the circle. And the second one is avoiding confrontation. There is this interesting story that I heard. So my grandfather was a registered hunter in Mozambique, in the north of the country, working for the Ministry of Agriculture. And the story he told me back in the days of colonialism is that specifically in where I'm from, in Nampula, they'll have these cotton plantations. And everywhere in the country, people were doing, demonstrations and picking up guns. You know how my people sabotaged agriculture back then? They will take all the seeds on the night and they will boil them and then dry them and then put them back on the sacks and do the entire plantation process. I mean, my background is in agricultural engineering. Planting a cotton, manually, it's a heavy, intense work. They will go through all that process. And then when, the farm managers will ask them, they'll be like, we don't know. We did as you told us. We don't know what's going on. So there is this thing of, don't avoid confrontation. I guess is the best way to describe that. I feel it's quite ingrained in most Mozambicans.
Yeah, but having traveled to all 54 African countries, I would say that is a fairly common thread in Africa, and that non-confrontational nature. And to me, I'm probably going to say things that are politically incorrect, but I don't give a shit. And to me, it was shocking because I had never been to Africa before my 5-year trip.
Okay.
And I had grown up in the United States. And African American culture, Black culture in America, is, you just need to watch videos and stuff like that, quite confrontational. often.
Yeah.
They're very much can be, as a culture, be aggressive and in your face and unafraid to be confrontational. So I was kind of, my naive sense going into Africa expecting the same, like I'm going to get people yelling at me and defying me. And I was just so surprised that everywhere I went in Africa, they would avoid confrontation. And it got to the point where it can be a problem, because sometimes they would tell me things like they're going to repair my car, and they would tell me, yeah, we'll have it done by tomorrow. And then they're like, okay, great, it's going to be done by tomorrow. And then it's not done by tomorrow. In fact, it's not done for another month.
Absolutely.
And because they just don't want the conflict, they don't want to fight. If they tell me it's going to take a month, Francis, they know it's going to create a fight. And I'm going to be like, what the hell? What do you mean it's going to take a month? So they rather just say, no, it'll be tomorrow. And they're like, this afternoon. And just on. And, it's ça va aller. It's going to be all right. Don't worry about it. It's going to be all right.
But,
and
it's been
they
years.
don't want to offend.
It's been years where if you will speak up, you'll get beaten. You're going to get punished if you've spoken up. So that's why most of the African cultures, even though I think at a core, even without colonization, most of African cultures are quite polite and quite, understanding and respectful. When you have such a harsh force coming in, it just like reinforces those. But I do have to say that in some sort of like some cultures in Mozambique, even for Mozambicans, they're quite confrontational. I think the best word would be they're outspoken. They're not necessarily confrontational, but they're quite outspoken, and it can be very hard to change their minds. And I think you have that in other African countries as well.
Yeah, that is true. But I would say the prevailing disposition of an African is incredibly polite, very respectful, patient, soft-spoken. Again, it was, I don't know, you went to the United States?
Yeah, I was in LA, New York.
Right. And so you got to meet African-American culture? I people?
Did. I got a chance.
Is my characterizing them off the mark, or do you think that was fair?
I think it depends on the group for sure.
Of course, yes. Of course
and I think something that I was actually having this conversation the other day with a client that's trying to come to many African countries is that if you compare Africa with other continents, it's not very hard for you to survive in Africa. I mean, especially if you don't have deserts, right? I mean, we don't have freezing cold temperatures most of the year. I mean, in Johannesburg can get quite cold. If you drop some seeds of tomato or whatever in your soil, you're probably going to have something. So people usually here don't have the tendencies to fight so much of our resources. And most of our mindset is if you have little, share, because, tomorrow, someone else might also be in the same position, just share. And I think that's where most of our, non-confrontational and quite understanding culture comes from, is that we are in a blessed land and we actually have some, it won't hurt if we share. And I feel even if I'm thinking about other Black or Africans in the diaspora, when the countries there is more fight around resources, people get quite, in the fight mode. I think Japan is an exception of it, where it's like we have so little, we cannot fight.
Right.
But most on the countries, I think it's quite different.
Yeah, Japan is an anomaly because it does have very few resources and they're packed like sardines there, and yet it is an incredible polite and respectful society. I mean, they are so, and they say it's because we have to be, because otherwise we'd go
exactly.
crazy.
There is no way.
But, yeah, exactly. But it is fascinating to me to hear how you hit something on the head, which is that there's a abundance of resources in Africa, and that yet when you are short on resources, there's a sharing culture that doesn't exist to the extent. Everybody likes to think of themselves, their culture, or their hometown as being, oh, we're so generous and sharing. But Africans do it almost to a fault, in the sense that the problem with the sharing culture and mentality that is so common in so many African countries I visited is that sometimes the downside of that is that it can encourage laziness, or the fact that it can encourage somebody to just sit back because my uncle will help me if I'm really hungry, and my auntie is going to help me if I need a place to stay. So So as a result, you always know somebody's going to cover your ass, versus in America, it's a brutal environment that your own parents will not support you. They'll leave you in the street if you just don't go work for yourself. And so as a result, that sharing culture is both the blessing and the curse of Africa.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Or what do you think?
I think it's the usage that you made or what you made out of it that can be good or bad. I mean, for me, a culture per se cannot be good or bad, but what we do with it. And I was actually having another conversation with an Asian client, Singaporean based, and we were talking about how, if you go into the core of long-term thinking of Japanese and Africans, it's not that different in the sense that even in African culture, when we think long-term, it's on generation things, So it's like, I'm going to be good to you because then tomorrow your kid is going to be good to my kid. Type of mindset that pretty much we have on Asia, but I think on Japan specifically. But then on Japan, they take it to a different level, where it is, so then I must make my family the most self-sustainable as it can be without relying necessarily on others. So I guess it's when the two cultures sort of differentiates from one another. And I think it's an interesting thing to see how it plays out with different countries within Africa and as well with, different countries within the world. But there is always this association between long-term thinking, availability of resources, and how people show up.
And that ends this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we've talked about, go to wanderlearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is always my social media username. My website is ftapon.com. Do you want to leave me an anonymous voicemail where you can make a comment or ask a question? Then go to speakpipe.com/ftapon. Furthermore, if you'd like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. Now, 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at wanderlearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.